Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to what's about to be the Futureproofing Next 88 Triggers to Innovation. And we'll get started in about a minute. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to Futureproofing Now's 88 Triggers to Innovation. Today we'll be talking about a new card deck that's the complete collection of starter questions to better innovation plus plus. It's designed to address the questions that we have around how to get unstuck in innovation. I'm Andrea Cates with Futureproofing Next, and I'm joined today with my co-founder, Sean Moffitt from Futureproofing Next. And we also have a guest with us, Emily Watkins. So today we'll introduce her, and the format for today is to talk about 88 cards and the concepts for how to get our innovation in corporations unstuck. Emily Watkins, Sean and I will be talking about the cards. We'll be picking our favorite cards. We'll be doing an overview of a deck of cards that's available for everyone to refer to. And it's also a preview to our upcoming book, Futureproofing Next, The Future Beyond Innovation. So this is what we call the 88 Triggers card deck. And first, let me introduce Emily, because Emily is an expert in the future of work and flexible workspace, and she's an innovation leader with many years of experience. For people that are listening on the podcast, 23 years of experience with global and national organizations. And she's experienced in senior real estate, cross-industry innovation, business to business, business to consumer, and most recently was an executive managing director at Jones Lang LaSalle, JLL, developing flexible space solutions for occupiers as well as investors of the commercial real estate. And her background is incredible. She's got degrees from UC Berkeley and Columbia University, and also has a background in structural engineering, architectural engineering from Cal Poly. And what we love about Emily is that she is also a practitioner. So as we go through these cards, she'll be giving us a lens on how to not just have a theoretical card, but what it means in real life to face challenges and use triggers like these 88 triggers to address them. So first, we're today in search of these beautiful questions. And what we think is really powerful is sometimes it's a better question that gets us to better solutions. So we're hoping that this is practical, that everyone on the call or the webcast or the podcast gets to be triggers, positive triggers around, gosh, we're stuck. We've been doing design thinking. We've been doing open innovation. We've been doing lean. Hopefully you've been doing future proofing. And yet you hit that moment where you need to break through. So what we say about questions is that basically, if today we have a dream, tomorrow we'll probably have a question that will unlock a new dream. And we're hoping that we can get to the idea that we'll have the right answer. There's probably many answers, and that we're hoping that we can spur a lot of questions in you as well. So what I'd like to do now is introduce Sean. Sean, why don't you weigh in a little bit on this topic, talk about why we developed the cards, and also talk a little bit about the 88 triggers.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I was like wondering about muting. I just find it fabulous that if I think about my own career, when I came into Procter & Gamble as a junior brand assistant, the mantra was, you better know the answers as the CEO comes walking down the hallway. So we had these big binders at the time. And it was like, better know what my market share was in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, otherwise my boss won't like me. Now I think if you're in a future-proof kind of, fashion-forward kind of company, you're probably more interested in what are some of those really interesting questions that are going to lead you to avenues of pursuit that your company isn't probably looking at. So the why, the what ifs, the how to's. And it's funny, just when you talk to people, people go, yeah, questions. And then you see them write a set of questions, maybe for a survey or a poll, or maybe some type of moderation. And you realize, there is a bit of, wizard behind the curtain stuff in terms of delivering good questions. So these are some of them: simple, specific, open,
And at the risk of sounding like we're doing shameless self-promotion with regards to not just the cards, but also the upcoming book, talk a little bit about this really important notion that we have at Futureproofing Next around this new point of departure.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was it, maybe a year and a half now, Andrea, we kind of stepped back and said, we're kind of angry about the whole space, very healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo. What is actually keeping us back to getting to the future? And so that was the general kind of first discussion premise of maybe we should write a book. And I think if you look at 5 of the big things that we saw early on as we were writing it, just how innovation standing within corporate life, how people look at it, it doesn't have a very high standing. And so why is it the CFO has the gravitas when they walk into the boardroom and the innovation suite doesn't? We also thought if there are 12 competencies of innovation, really there's a very narrow focus even in some of the better companies that do this. And so how do we expand their lens in terms of what they can do? Speed and scale, and we're going to talk about a lot of that as our questions try to address this. Key. There seems to be this broadening. I think we even mentioned how this pandemic's probably broadened kind of what is our aspiration to what is the reality that we want to achieve. Some companies have got past it. And finally, leaders say they have a culture, but there is the ostrich head in the sand where their employees kind of go, maybe not. So there is some cognitive dissonance. So we thought, why not build a set of questions that get past some of these obstructions? Maybe next slide.
Yeah. So the other framing for this is the key changes that we saw. You talked a little bit about the lack of satisfaction with a lot of what we've been calling corporate innovation, but what are some of the key changes? The impact of that.
Yeah, and I think whatever models we used 10, 15, 20 years ago, they have either been rendered irrelevant or perhaps a little bit less effective based on the speed of both technology and the marketplace. It's interesting how customers just want more. Some days it's like, business would be great if it wasn't for customers because they're very demanding. Culture has totally changed. We see every day a new movement started that kind of reappraises kind of what we think about the world. I know in most of our stuff, we're looking very wide in terms of looking at cross-industry, looking at business models as opposed to just innovation. And finally, I think we're really getting it now. I'll be interested in Emily's thoughts on this, but I think, the top challenges of today, yes, are definitely business-driven, and yes, are employee and customer-driven, but just as much their community, their city, their planet-driven.
So I'd like you to pose a question to Emily and Andrea. Sean, you're always really great at the deep questions that get beyond and beneath the surface. So what question do you have to pose to Emily and Andrea as we get kicked off here?
Maybe it's the numbers guy. I've been known as Spock in another life. So the data-based nature of my thing says, well, why did we land on 88? And we may know the answers, but I don't know. What's your key thoughts? Like 88's a weird kind of number. That's a big number. Why 88?
Well, I'll use this as the moment to introduce Emily and let her weigh in first. So first of all, welcome Emily to the conversation. We're super excited to have you. And anything you wanted to add to your background that we might have left off in the initial introduction?
I think you covered it, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. It's so much fun to join you. So why 88? Well, I've got to start with the auspiciousness of the number 8. So that's what at least it makes me think about.
Okay, and I thought immediately about piano keys. It's really great to think about what in the world is 88. So the thought is, we've worked in China, so the number 8 is super good luck in China, double happiness. That's always good. But for me, it was like, here you are in the world of corporate innovation, and you got lots of keys, minor keys, major keys, black keys, white keys. There's so many options. You sit down at the piano, you have to start somewhere. It isn't always middle C. So I was thinking, okay, maybe 88 would be a good place to start because there's so much music you can make with the basics. So how do we do, Sean?
Pretty good. I mean, I think all answers do apply. You got a number of constellations that are out there. Remember Back to the Future, he had to reach 88 miles per hour to get back and forth in time, which is a little bit of what we're doing. Radium, one of the most kind of very volatile substances. Sometimes questions can create some volatility, which is sometimes good. And it's a palindrome. You look at 88 and it's like, there's an evenness to that, which I think when we look at good questions and triggers, there's some balance, there's some neutralness in terms of not leading the witness too far down the road to getting a really good, innovative answer back. So that's
Great.
my numerology for today.
And also I'll do a housekeeping, which is we really encourage you to ask us questions. And I'm going to ask Sean to be monitoring those because in Zoom, it's hard to see your questions coming in when you're running the deck. So let me first do an overview because we do have 4 suits. And the reason that we have 88 triggers is actually pretty basic. We came up with a new framework and we're hoping that Futureproofing Next, our book, is going to be what we call like the new book on the bookshelf, that it's the new, we keep saying it's going to be the dog-eared book that's on your shelf, you know, like you keep pulling it out and using it for different things. So we'll give you the grounding in case, kind of like the card deck, if you want to play solitaire or poker in the middle of the day. We hope you'll pull it out and understand we've got 4 suits, and I'll do this a little bit for framing and then we'll jump into our favorite cards. So the first suit is C, and we have a 4-part process: see, learn, decide, commit. And Sean and I realized that those were the 4 most important forces to actually go from innovation mindset to innovation delivery. And so the first one is, suit number 1 is C. And we won't make you take a midterm on this, but just so you know, each of the 4 categories also has 2 subcategories. So there's 2 subsuits. Suit 1C, how do we see differently? How do we see inside now? How do we see the integrated forces coming at us? So that's the first suit that we'll talk about. The next suit is learn. You know, how do we imagine and inform? You can't just imagine because you'll end up with flying cars and fantasy. But you can't just inform because, no offense to Spock, Sean, but you end up with kind of incremental thinking sometimes, or looking at only predictions when you can't think more broadly. So that very cool combination of imagination and information. The third is deciding. And we've been in so many rooms where room A is saying something, room B is saying something, they're both defensible. But unfortunately, you have to inspire, but also have impact. So without decisions, leadership is lost. You know, you're funding too many things, you've got no alignment. And commitment's the part that we're really excited about, the 4th suit, where, I hate to say it, but it's your heart and soul that's in it. It doesn't sound logical to call business a place where your feelings should be, but we really think that commitment is super important because that means that there's will on the part of leadership. So let Emily talk about these 4 suits first, and then we'll get into some of the favorite cards. What are your thoughts about how we've developed the 4 suits?
I think it's a really lovely structure, Andrea. I think the challenge that corporations always face is how to make sure that you're moving new initiatives forward while you're preparing for what could potentially come and what could potentially challenge you. And so having this kind of a framework really sort of takes that confusion out of it. I think it also prevents you from getting stuck into a single model that may not necessarily help you cover off on everything that you need to in order to be successful.
Well, there are people that really love structure. I think all of us do, probably everyone on the call today and in listening in like structure. So we're hoping that see, learn, decide, commit becomes, we have tattoos. I hope everybody will join us in that. and then for the engineers among us and the data hounds, we have a more detailed view of this, which is, and we won't do this, but in the book, you'll see that there's a really pretty visual way of seeing the details. And we're excited that there's canvases for every one of these and tools for every one of these. So you pull out the book, you can today take out a card and move yourself forward, or in the book, you'll be able to move to tools and canvases within the book. So let's look at the first suit, and we'll look at C, inside now. And there are lots of them. I won't go into all of them because we'll run out of time so quickly today, but there are cards that are representative of every single aspect of what we think is important for the C inside now. And what I'd like to do is have Emily talk about the one that you like the best. We actually, in the spirit of full disclosure, we asked Emily to look at the cards in advance and pick her favorite. So we're not doing a magic trick here where she's just randomly finding a card. We actually knew in advance which one she would pick. So Emily, tell us a little bit about your favorite card.
Yeah. So in C, I really like which aspects of our company will challenge our ability to achieve this future readiness. And so as I really think about efforts to develop innovative solutions in my past, this would have been wonderful to utilize to get away from those performance metrics that were always focused on the past. And especially now, metrics really need to change in order to drive corporate cultures toward adopting new solutions. So, for example, in corporate real estate, we've always focused on cost per square foot, but so many initiatives now need to focus on employee experience. So, all of these metrics just completely need to change. The ability to do that up front, I think, would be really fantastic to sort of get you out of your comfort zone.
Well, we're lucky because we've also worked with you in the past and seen your visionary skills in action. And it's interesting because you have to be kind of part Vulcan and part imagination person, right? You have to be able to have metrics that everybody relates to, so it doesn't seem that you're doing a workaround, right? And just
Right.
ignoring the metrics. So, you know, in your experience, how do you do this? How do you get people to think differently so that they can, you know, kind of get past that mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's nice about this being in the C suit, in the earlier on suit, is you're actually forcing the conversation earlier. And I think that's really powerful because often you don't have that conversation until you're sort of completing investment cases and getting to that space. So I think it's timing. And then I think it's kind of putting a stake in the ground and saying, here's the things we're going to think about differently.
Sean, any experiences that you'd like to add to this theme?
Well, I love Emily's point about the fact this is so upfront in the process. I find sometimes I look at our fellow peer innovators and change agents, and you probably both had this conversation where it's like, they just don't look like they're set up for success. And I think part of it is they're not smart. They don't have great ideas. They don't maybe have a roadmap that looks very elegant and the Gantt chart looks like it makes sense. It's really, some of the core elements of what's going to make them successful. And we've got an audit tool that actually goes through some of that. But I think in simple terms, it's like, is your company ready to do this? And then if I took it even one step further down, Andrea, is your team ready for it?
Right.
And are you ready for it as well? So there's almost kind of three subsets of the question, maybe.
So in the interest of people who are watching, you can now see that we're moving from the first part of the suit, C, to the next one, which is C, integrated forces. And there's cards that represent each of these. Some of them I'll just read for the people that aren't watching. Which technologies can be critical? What are the elements of what we're calling exploration challenge statements? We really encourage people to come up with framing, kind of measure twice, cut once, figure out what it is you're looking for before you start looking. A lot of people start hackathons and lean startup projects and pilots and cohorts. And at the end of the day, they don't say, after this, what are we optimizing for? What do we think the future is? Where do we have agency over the future versus, oh, well, here's the prediction and we better go there passively. So we asked Emily to pick her favorite, and we have a couple. Talk about either one, Emily. Read it first and then tell us what you liked about it and your experience.
Yeah. So the first one, which companies and other industries can inspire our future growth? I love this one. And again, my background being in commercial real estate on the retail side, as well as on the office side, is sort of my lens and where a lot of the innovative solutions that I've worked on over the years have been focused. And what I love about this one is I think that corporations that have commercial office real estate can look at how retail brands have driven experiences digitally to drive culture and connectedness. And I think this is critical right now. I'll give you an example. It's not necessarily a new one, but Sephora, I think, has done a great job at this. And they're one of the early brands in specialty retail that created online learning experiences where their makeup artists provided these tutorials using their products. And they then took that online experience and they created stations within the store where you could actually access these tutorials live as you sampled their products. So again, little example, but learning from these sort of deep digital first experiences that some brands out there have done incredibly successfully, I think can be great to drive customer and employee experience in physical space that can really sort of launch your culture forward.
I like that a lot. And we talk a lot about this new point of departure. And the new point of departure for this one is really interesting. When I was in business school, we studied benchmarking. We would benchmark our industry against others, our quote peers in our industry. And we've seen over the past 10 years that we're just as likely to be competing with someone who's not even on our radar. So I love what you're saying. What is Sephora doing really well that can inspire commercial real estate or other industries? And that's one of the things that we're really looking at.
Yeah.
So let me let you do the second one, and then I'll let Sean weigh in.
Yeah, so for the second one, when it comes to talent, how can we tap into trends to fuel growth? I think this would have been an amazing focus in developing new experiences for Generation Z in retail. And I think that looking at those trends that are driving the purchasing behaviors for Gen Z, such as micro influencers on social platforms, sustainability focused campaigns, and then imagery that promotes kind of selfies and showcases your product in new and exciting ways, I think is an interesting example to say, let's just sort of pull all these trends and think about what really applies that can help us grow.
Well, I'll let Sean weigh in on this because C, we have these two elements of C that we've just talked about. What do you want to say about other industries? We've talked about retail, we've talked about commercial real estate. What are some other industries or other examples that you think will help the people in our future-proofing world?
Well, I think one thing, Andrea, like the temptation is always to say, oh, can we be the Apple of this industry or the Amazon of this industry? And I think that's very surface level, right? I mean, it's great to have aspiration, but I think sometimes it's better to actually think about that small little company that's doing wondrous things in Europe that no one's heard about, and what can we import from there? I think that'd be one thing. I think back to the second thing that was on the screen about trends and how they could fuel growth from a talent perspective. I think, the one thing I know for sure, the future of work, where people will work, how they reappraise, how they work, all of that has fundamentally changed. There are going to be things like people are going to jump back on planes 5 years from now and maybe they'll have figured it out. But that whole idea of where we work, how we need to collaborate with people, and some of the things HR practitioners are saying, look, it's not all bad, but we really need to figure out how, from a talent perspective now, September 2020, we need to figure out how people work together. And I think there's an opportunity almost right in front of our faces that a lot of people should be looking at.
Super helpful. And I'll go back to now the next section in now, which is imagine. So we've talked a little bit about C, and clearly we could have spent a lot more time with C, but this is now learn. And one of the things that we keep saying is that and it seems like the pandemic has been a wonderful experience for this, because suddenly overnight, the healthcare industry had to learn how to do remote medicine. And overnight, the people who were running normal companies had to understand what virology is to keep their employees safe and what work from home looks like. So we were able to learn much more quickly than we have in the past. And we view this as a competitive advantage. So learn some of the themes we've talked about in the cards, and I won't read all of them, but what are models that we can apply? We have idea boards in our structure. Which subject experts can we learn from quickly? Because there's so many ways to learn. What's the best way to scout startups? Because there's so much know-how going on all over the world with startups. And how do we leverage our current customer relationships to drive progress? What are ways that we can really, you can learn anything online now. So I'll go to Emily now, to the one that you picked. And you have, first it says, what is the biggest potential gain in taking on the exploration challenge statement? And this is having to do with leadership, culture, competitiveness. So what did you love about this card, and give us some examples?
Okay. So the biggest potential gain in taking on the challenge statements. I think for this, the fact that you sort of take a step back to really think through these three areas, right? Leadership, culture, and competitiveness, because I think you can start to go too fast and sort of lose the idea that all of these sort of three areas are pretty important to stay focused on sort of what your challenge is. So not necessarily leading you astray, or being prepared for any potential changes that might occur in sponsorship and leadership that can take place. So I think kind of creating sort of that focused vision of here's how this can sort of keep you focused on where you're going. You always want to be able to pivot, but you want to be able to be pretty directed in what you're trying to accomplish.
So before I get to Sean, I'd like to ask everyone who's here live to weigh in a little bit on the chat, if you would, of something that you are excited about in terms of this theme of learn, because we're trying to learn as well. So we will read this later and understand what is it that your company or your team has had to learn to get ahead in terms of your own innovation or competitive advantage. So Sean, before we move on to the next one, what's your thought about the learn, imagine next, and these exploration challenge statements?
Yeah, I think, it's the one thing within our structure, I guess, that people go, maybe I've never worked with challenge statements before. Essentially challenge statements are kind of broad and focused, but it is a focus, right? Like, we don't ask people to go out and try to cure the world. I mean, there is some focus and structure to, at this point, we go, great, you've now decided that you want to own September. Great. How do you do that? And so I think that's maybe the one thing, semantics within our world, that maybe begs some explanation. But I love the fact that, we've got this little cadence in terms of our see, learn, decide, commit, where it's like, great, we're narrowing. Nope. Let's go a little bit wider and then narrow again. Right. And I think the best innovation processes do that. And I think, from a leadership culture competitiveness one, which is this specific question, I don't know what you guys think, but I don't know if we're that good at it as corporate people to actually look at ourselves clearly and go, we have gaps in leadership, or our culture, isn't quite healthy enough, or we're set up for success competitively. I think there is a level of, and I think I mentioned it in my stats earlier, where people kind of say that's somebody else's problem over there, we're great. And so having a good question that elicits some of that, and maybe even ask people across levels in a company, is probably a very good thing to ask.
Yeah. So Emily, thoughts on that?
I like that. I think that's really true. And I like the idea that can kind of keep you consistent when you're focusing on sort of diverging and converging through the innovation process. So, yeah.
Well, I'll talk a little bit now about the next theme, which is also part of learn, and we're still hoping that everybody weighs in a little bit on the chat. But there's another part of learn, which is when you go into the experiments, and there's learning about cross industry, there's learning to inspire us, and then this is literally learning about what we're focused on. And we are very much aligned with some of the lean techniques here and the ways that you can take a project and have validation, have evidence. So Emily, first of all, anything that you want to say in general about this, and then we'll go to your cards. There are things about metrics, there are things about testing, there are things about analytics, there are ways for us to think more innovatively. Believe it or not, to give logistics a bit of love. We think that there's a lot of innovation that can come from the places that aren't usually viewed as sexy, like innovation and data. So anything, I'll go to your two favorite cards and you tell us what you like the most.
Yeah. Well, let me start with whose buy-in matters during the experimentation stage and how can we get it. So this is something that I feel like we don't typically re-ask ourselves when we get to the experimentation stage. And I think that forcing yourself to sort of take a step back and really ask this question will help potentially drive pivots that'll make you more successful. So, an example in my past, we worked on a solution that had a change in sponsorship, a significant change in sponsorship where, one retired and then a new sponsor comes into play. And we didn't necessarily spend the extra time to work through how that would evolve, how we wanted to kind of talk about this both internally as well as externally. And so this type of question, I think, would have triggered that. And we would have actually spent the time to kind of, really think through that. So that's what I like about that one.
So Sean, any thoughts on that, the notion of buy-in during experimentation? Because it's unusual. We hadn't seen it anywhere else.
Yeah, and certainly, I don't know if when we kind of conduct this exercise, whether, I think one of the revelations is just not thinking about other things, but also looking around the room and seeing who everybody else thinks is their customer or who needs to get buy-in on this. I think two ways to approach it. One, it's just where are the surprises and how do we pursue them, or what's the consensus in terms of who the most important person we need to get buy-in from. So yeah, I'm thinking about my own kind of innovation corporate past where it's just, I think, Procter and Gamble, for example, very top-down company. A lot of it was pleasing the CEO. And so how do you tease out this tension of, I want to make sure the CEO is happy, but that's not the best thing for the customer? My hope is this question gets at some of those challenges.
Yeah, I like that. And I also like, Emily, how you viewed it as a way to, basically you can succeed and fail at the same time. Any cohort or any pilot can probably have internal validation. It makes sense. There's traction, there's a market, there's economic reasons. But if people's hearts and minds are not convinced that this is the problem to be solving or that this is the way to do it, then you won't get what we call permission to proceed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Emily, what's your next one?
Okay, so the next one, and I think that this is potentially one of my favorites. Can you still hear me? There we go.
Yes, we can. It sounds great.
All right. So what are the leaps of faith that we need to test? Now, you guys gave me a sneak peek into yes, and but no. And so I got to tell you, I just love that one. So I'll go into that a little bit. But again, if I can have a favorite, this is it. So I can think of a new solution that we created where we had utilized yes and no but. If we had done that, we would have allowed ourselves to kind of dwell within the concepts a little bit more. And that would have, I think, created more around sharing the challenges that would really refine kind of what we needed to do differently. So for example, a new innovative solution that we came up with had some disincentive in the minds of the sales channel. And that is really a challenge, but you might not necessarily find that unless you really dig in with using the concepts of asking mentors to give you some yes and challenges as well as the no but challenges. And I think when you use those statements and when you actually sort of dwell in the concepts a little bit more, it can really be powerful to sort of illuminate what you might discover that you didn't necessarily anticipate you were going to discover. And so again, you always lay out your leaps of faith, but really digging into them and spending the time to sort of come up with those statements, I think is incredibly powerful. So
I'll jump in for a second to clarify one part, and then we are going to get into the confession that we want you to make about how you learned about yes and.
Yeah.
I hope you're comfortable. So one of the things that you can't tell from the way we're showing the cards is not only is there a question, but there's an example and there's usually something inspirational on the card itself. So it's not just a question, but it's a question with some very basic news you can use. And one of the things that we've learned over the past few years is that Sean and I have been working with this mindset where you can get into either mindset. Like, well, I can give you 50 reasons this isn't going to work. Well, guess what? Prove to me that the quarterly earnings are going to be the same with this new initiative as the stuff that we know really well. Well, we can't. And so therefore you can vote it down. So you can get in that no but mindset. If you're challenging a person who maybe by nature is that way, to say yes and, like, let's just do the exercise of imagining that this could work. It's a lot of different thinking and usually good problem solving and collaborative working that's brought out through that exercise. So Emily, would you share with us kind of how you learned? We stole this from stand-up comedy, just so people know this technique.
Yeah. Well, and it is so powerful. Yes and is incredibly powerful. So when I was in business school, we actually took a class through Columbia where we learned about the power of improv and yes and through a Second City instructor. So he actually came and took our cohort sort of through this exercise, and you stand in a circle and you literally take a concept and you throw it at each other, and you are not allowed to reject it. You are not allowed to reject it, which is just fabulous. And so the perspectives that you get on this and you keep it moving are what are so powerful. And I think it's really applicable to business. And that was, many years ago, but I think it's incredibly powerful. And it's something that I forget to do. And I even, took the class. So something that we definitely need to pull back into our arsenals.
And I'll add one other thing, and then we'll go to the next topic, is that for global audiences, it works really well, and it works really well remote because you can hold up a card yes, and write your ideas down and start generating cards. And even virtually, we've discovered that drawing a picture of what might be possible, these are really mind-opening approaches that can be done so well when things are at a standstill. So Sean, before I go on to the next card, anything you want to add to this?
Well, this is one of the reasons. I'll get really malicious here now and say this is one of the reasons why we hate SWOT analysis, right? I just did one with a charity, and you're already constrained resource-wise. Not-for-profits don't have a lot of money, and it's like, it felt like we went through the exercise. Oh, thank God we have 5 strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Oh, check that box. And back to Emily's point and your point, Andrea, it's like the articulation of a really interesting leap of faith and a yes and can really be a provocation into some really interesting areas versus we got 20 of them and we don't know which is most important, and they're not even articulated well, nor do they provide anything more than a surface level understanding of what's happening now versus the future. So don't get us started on SWOT. Don't get started on 5 forces.
Really?
Had to throw that on.
We love them, and yes, and. So we've gone from see, learn, and it's see, learn, decide, commit. So now we're on the third one, which is decide. And interestingly, we think that this is the tricky one in a lot of ways, because once again, you can create a spreadsheet that defends so many different competing ideas. And I remember when I was working at Cisco, and they don't mind if I tell the story, I was very lucky to be a global innovation in residence, innovator in residence. And we had a hackathon, of course, and there were all these great ideas. And at the end, they were all wonderful. And the question is, as a judge, like, which one should I pick? And so talked to one of my mentors there and sponsors and said, so what are their criteria? And he's like, well, that's what we want you to help us with. I mean, it wasn't that they were clueless, but they, like, you could optimize for so many things, and they were all able to be defended. So this is where deciding is really important, because it's not that there's one, and you have to be able to kick yourself if some startup does it and you didn't. So I'd like to talk about a few of the cards that we have, and then talk with Emily about her favorites. So one of the things about deciding, first of all, you have to be honest, right? You have to know what you're optimizing for and what that might look like without a lot of knowledge about the future. The questions are, who could we partner with? How could we simulate this? How could we co-create to imagine differently? How can we expand the business model? Really hard to do that inside your 4 walls. You always need to bring in more stimulation here. And then also it has to do with eliciting ideas from experts in fields that you might not know. If there's something that is important to the decision that is involving a technology or something from outside your industry. And so this can be about supply chain, it can be about value chain. So the one that you picked, Emily, is what field experiences can we explore? Are there site visits that could inspire us to think bigger? Walk us through why this was your favorite and your experience with this.
So an example of this, and I think very relevant right now, would be, obviously from my lens, would be, how do we think about bringing health and safety into the workplace? And so one thing that I thought of that, this would have really triggered some thoughts and some probably pretty powerful new concepts was visiting places where we actually do feel safe and identify what we can learn from those. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, a simple kind of safety, but something like Disney. I think there's such a great example, but, Disney has one way in and one way out, right? It's pretty safe because you always see staff. So, that type of thing made me compare it back to commercial real estate for corporate, right? But like visible day porters or spa-like experiences that make us feel healthy and relaxed. The smells of a health food store. Now that might be good or bad, but some people might, relate that to health. So I think thinking about site visits and places that you could go that inspire you to sort of broaden the thinking, I think can be really, really powerful in helping to sort of ensure that you're moving these concepts forward and making the right decisions.
Well, I'll jump one in and then I'll throw it to Sean. I remember we were working with a large healthcare organization in the United States, and they were looking at a new approach to their care delivery. And so we took them up to Chicago, to Italy, where there were all these, really interesting, very animated, very active experiences in terms of the tasting and the different vendors that had totally different experiences, all next to each other so that people didn't have to have a uniform health experience. If they were in the mood, if they were with their kids, they needed to be kind of entertained and distracted. That was really different from if they were with an elderly relative and needed to feel quiet and peaceful. And so this notion of bringing them to Italy really sparked some new thinking for the healthcare organization. Sean, any thoughts about this one?
Well, I'm just going to date us in September 2020 land again, where it's like field experiences can also be digital, right? I think given the fact that some of us can't now, but I know we're going through, I mean, we live our own breakfast here, I guess, Andrea. We're turning our Futureproofing Next stuff into a training curriculum. What have we done? We've actually sat through training ourselves. Some of it's been good, some of it's been bad, but we've learned through the experience that if we were to do this ourselves, this is what it would look like, and take some of the best and leave the chaff away. So I think,
yeah, that's a great example. And, you know, we're looking at everything from 100,000 person stadium experiences delivered virtually and rock concerts all the way through to university experiences. So yeah, it's a great example. So the other part of See, Learn, Decide, Commit is impact. And this is part of the second part of Decide, where you're looking at economic impact, value impact, the strongest components of it across multiple dimensions, joint ventures. This is where the rubber meets the road for investors, for a corporate venture mindset, how you look at this in tranches, how you think like a corporate investor, and the ideas of really looking at whether your initiative is not just able to be done as a pilot, but what it would look like to scale it. And Emily, you picked a great one, which is there a test you could do right now to assess the go-to-market planning? So you have a pilot, it's come through an experimentation phase, but tell us about why you picked this an example.
Yeah. So I think the key for this one is right now. And in some of your notes that you had in your materials, you had some rules of thumb about simulating as much as possible with the least amount of production investment, which I think is just such a great message. And we do always sort of put these mantras on ourselves about sort of fast and furious, but this is not so easy to do. And in developing some new solutions for clients that we came up with around flexible space, coming up with what would have been the fastest implementation to kind of, you know, get the minimum viable product up and running and test quickly should have been so much more of a priority than it was for us. And I really think that could have given us a lot more insights and allowed us to move faster. So this is one that I think is really important. And, you know, it's easy to sort of say it like, oh yeah, we're going to move fast and get these few pilots and they're up and running, but to craft it right with the minimum amount of investment in order to really test what you're trying to achieve, I think is just such a great thing to do in order to drive success.
So Sean, you want to jump in?
well, I agree with, I mean, I've agreed with everything Emily said. So, I mean, we look for debate and we can't, but, you know, who really does this well? Shopify. I think some of the SaaS companies that, I'm a huge fan of A/B testing, and I think it's within the reach of the, you know, $100,000 company as opposed to the $100 million company. Like just to completely change your website over to something and be seen by a different audience or a different geography makes so much sense to me. And so, yeah, I think, you know, digitized companies have maybe a greater capacity to look at go-to-market planning a little bit differently. Right? They see it in increments of days and weeks of learning versus how can we actually, you know, spend 6 months prototyping something and then maybe doing something else. And sometimes, you know, there's regulatory concerns or whatever, but I think SaaS companies, this is where I think corporates can learn a lot from kind of their startup cousins in terms of the speed and in terms of what they're able to pull off in a very short period of time.
I'll do a blend from what we were just doing, see, learn, decide. So we just did decide in this idea of how you have to, first of all, get buy-in from people during the experimentation and during the see and learn and decide phases. So you can't just suddenly get to this stage we're about to talk about, commit, and expect people, as I keep saying, hearts and minds to be in the game. So you have a meeting in September, and then all of this stuff happens, and then the next February, you're coming back to them. That's not enough to get really what we're going to call commit. And so I like what Sean and Emily, what you just said about the way that you can take an experiment and bring people in to see the results midstream. You can build not just a minimum viable product that, you know, everything doesn't have to be a drone. It can actually be something that's much more indicative of how scalable the project might be. So you can do A/B tests, you can do in-market tests that focus in on the one thing that you think is the biggest risk. And I think that that's really powerful. And as Emily said earlier, you can bring people into that, share with them what you've learned rather than showing this perfect little project at the commit stage and asking people what they think. If they understand how much has been learned, how much progress you've made, and how scalable it is, that's usually really critical. So that brings us to commit. See, learn, decide, commit. And this will be on the midterm, is to be able to recite those at the end of the webinar. So commit is the last row. And what we think is really, it's new. We haven't seen it in a lot of corporate innovation like literature, which is why Sean and I realized that that's really what's been missing. You've got these fantastic ideas coming out like gems. And if people don't understand them, they will not fund them. If there's no P&L leadership within the company because they think it's too risky, they will be orphaned or organ rejected. And so this is super important because at the end of the day, what we've observed, and we're lucky to look at 13,000 teams doing this, what we've learned is that it's the initiatives that have commitment behind them that do the best longer term. So we've got a few like, how do you look at trends overall and have sensors in the market to make sure you're not blindsided? What's the ideal profile of talent to drive it? I mean, there's a myth that people who invent the first stage of a project are the ones to lead it through. And unfortunately, that's not true. Most of what happens in corporate life, there's core and edge, and the edge concepts don't necessarily get the best approach in terms of scaling within a company. You sometimes have to change the leadership there. And we have a term that we use in terms of storytelling, that if people don't have a 3-beat story that resonates with their internal stakeholders, you know, that leadership team, the P&L leaders that have to take this on, if there's not a good 3-beat story, and we don't mean fiction, we mean the reason why, then it's probably going to end up on the cutting room floor. So we'll look at what Emily picked as your favorite commit card in implement. What are the narratives that will bring leaders to support the initiative?
Yeah, so this one really resonated with me because a new solution that we created many years ago was a sort of variable facility management solution. And as I sort of reflect on what bringing this type of a question into that dialogue could have done for that product, I think it could have really given it way more legs than it had. It was definitely successful in and of its own right, but I think the real piece of this is that it could have solved an interesting concern, which was omitting sort of this commoditization of the facility management world and facility management process. So had we sort of positioned it in this narrative, I think it might have driven a lot more engagement from the internal teams that were then sort of your sales channel to sell this within to sort of different account teams. So to me, this is big. The story, you have to really be thinking, you have to zoom out and really be thinking about, you know, how does the narrative need to be different or feel different or change in order to sort of maximize? And, you know, I haven't ever sort of thought of this type of question at this stage. And that's what, but yet it would have been really easy to do, right? Like think about the biggest disruptors and think about, is there a narrative here that's going to be more helpful? So that, I think this is definitely pretty breakthrough to be able to sort of force yourself to have this thinking at this stage.
I'll do a quick comment, then I'll turn it to Sean to comment as well before we go to the last category. One of the reasons that we think narrative is so important is that it forces you to be in the shoes of the person you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And we're so many times taught, you know, if we're in a product field, we're taught to talk about features without talking about benefits. And we're taught to talk about the science behind it and the IP. And we're not really talking about the value proposition to the person we're talking to. And we
Right.
also make the mistake of thinking that just because a customer likes something means that the VP of production is going to understand it from her point of view. And so there's a really important moment that it's not one size fits all in these narratives, that it's really first stepping back, as you said, Emily, and thinking, what is it that this person cares about? And how will what we're about to talk about resonate with them? So Sean, as we move into the last one, what thoughts do you have about this part of commit?
Well, it's funny because we've looked at innovation, and classically people look at it as a very deterministic type of thing. It's like there's facts and there's arguments and the idea of narrative implies a level of humanness, right? Now, I would say 99% of people I've dealt with in the industry, I'm leaving a special 1% where I'm not quite too sure if they're a human. So I don't know if a compelling narrative might have helped, but I think people on the basis of it are making decisions in business because they're human. They may have different criteria. And I think the importance of narrative is getting the team on your side. We used to go into our CEO at a previous company I was at, and if he knew that everybody on that team was singing to the same beat and actually nodding at the same moments, he was in. We just kind of realized in a few months' time, it's like, man, like when there's dissent amongst us, that's when we don't get things through. So I think humanness, I think getting team on board and leaders on board, they're not mutually exclusive. And I think, just a level of emotion in your story too. We've got different archetypes in our model. And I think there's a difference between we're not quite there yet and we're failing to we've got momentum and we're a steamroller about to roll over. Those two things might be exactly the same thing, but served up differently, get a different result.
Well, I like all of this, and we're coming into the home stretch in terms of immerse. The final part of commit, I'll keep saying it, see, learn, decide, commit, is something I never thought was important ever, that you have to really make sure that all of the human side of this is and all of the emotional part. And as I said earlier, the hearts and the minds. And business is not usually viewed as a human place, but this has really been the difference between initiatives that go forward and initiatives that have lip service. And part of this is that we spent a couple years now, more than a year, digging into what works in terms of group commitment. So I'll read a few of these and then I'll let Emily talk about her last favorite card. So in the commit stage, outside experts like a guild, people who continually stimulate you from lots of places, can breathe life into your project. And Sean and I have worked on these. And actually, I think we worked with Emily on one years ago, where we were brought in from the outside to breathe some life, to have new possibilities, to bring that yes and thinking. And we love to serve in that role. Some rituals so that you're not just saying, well, one and done. We funded that X months ago and we're done with that. There's a sense of giving it a life of its own that's really important for these initiatives. The things that you do to reinforce the leaders and engage them, not just get them to vote on the budget. The shifts that you have to make in the culture. If you know that you need to have more of a collaborative culture for something to work, if you've identified something in the experiment stage that's a risk, you really need to build that into the culture. It's just going to go right back to business as usual. And then the dashboards. I think Emily said something great earlier. If you make your dashboards the same as they always were, you will never give these new initiatives a chance to survive and thrive. So Emily picked this final card, which was, what would the ideal work environment be for this project as it scales? How will you design, build, and provide that?
It's funny how Emily would pick that.
So one thing that you guys mentioned as part of your notes on this trigger was the study that Google did behind outperforming teams. And they identified that the common element at the heart of that success was psychological safety. And it's a great article for those of you who haven't read it. And I love it because it's something that really can help you think about how to create teams. And as I reflect on the teams that I've created in the past in order to actually sort of own and nurture these ideas throughout, I think this is really at the heart of it. So a deep focus on team connectedness at critical stages in the development of different products, and knowing that the composition of that team can and should evolve, but always in a way that focuses first on ensuring that you take the time to build that trust and connectedness. So, you know, for example, when you do this, you ensure that you're bringing together a group of people that are willing to speak up and share concerns or different perspectives that might not go along with sort of the general flow, that can be really powerful. So that safety of being able to sort of speak up about what you think and what you're concerned with at these different stages, and especially at the end when you're like, wow, we've done all this work and now there's this new concern and new thought, that's incredibly powerful. Getting it out there and having people comfortable enough that they will speak up.
Well, I'll give a bit of a commercial for the person who wrote the book, The Fearless Organization. It's Amy Edmondson. And as you said, Emily, exactly right, that Google studied this and found that this psychological safety, which was one of Amy Edmondson's thoughts, has now become really important. And she wrote this great book we're giving credit to, The Fearless Organization. The other part of this that we think is so powerful is that in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not okay for a few people in the room to nod their heads and think that that means scale and acceptance and commitment is there, that we need to be really proactive in terms of how we get many other voices, much more reflective of a global community, much more reflective of the diverse customer base we might have and the other stakeholders. And so we think this is a really powerful card. Once again, you're right. We have the card, we have the concepts, we have the examples, we have the examples, we have the rules of thumb on each of the cards. So Sean, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, and just your I don't know if we're being censored here, Andrea, but your volume kind of went down just like a minute or 2 minutes ago. So one of the people in the chat room had said that too.
Hopefully I'm back on.
Once again, I think between the three of us and maybe some of the people that chimed in today, we are going to solve this for our current online situation, right? How do we create this work environment that, as Emily mentioned, builds trust and creates that psychological safety? I find, you know, I work with a lot of different people, and given the fact it's all online, it's all remote, it's really tough to sense, are they into what we're talking about? Are we building this truly together? Are there two different versions of this that we're building? Somehow, like Miro and Zoom and something else needs to have a baby and actually create kind of a digital space that allows us to look like a playground.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop the part of the conversation, but we always like to do around the horn. So let's see, that's not the one. So round the horn, which means we are so committed to see, learn, decide, commit, that we love to find out from Emily, what did you either see differently, learn from today's conversation, make a decision about, or maybe commit to based on today? What are some big takeaways that you had?
Yeah, well, I'm really inspired by this as a tool that can actually sort of force asking the questions throughout the entire process. And I think we get so stuck in utilizing a model that what I'm really excited about is the idea that this is a simple tool. You can pull these out and force conversation throughout the entire process in order to make sure that not only are you on track, but that you're driving optimal success. So for me, I think it's really about reminding ourselves that we can do this. We can use these tools in really simple ways to actually force the discussions.
So I think that's really interesting, and we'll each say one last thing of words of thanks to you before we close out. Sean, anything you want to say in terms of the thank you from us to Emily?
Well, I mean, Emily is a true joy just because we gave her the 88 ahead of time, and it was just like you forensically went through them, got excited about them. And in some respect, I don't know if you're our alpha tester on these, but I mean,
I think I am.
You're totally the alpha tester, like the one person that we've looked at with the full 88. So I'm glad they've resonated so well. I love how you've taken a corporate environment that you were previously at, and it makes sense in that world. So I have some hope that for the other 30 industries that we might be looking at in terms of rolling this out, it also has the same resonance.
So thank you to Emily, and this was really awesome. We have a couple more slides at the end to let people know where we go from here, but this was really incredible. This was all about what we keep saying, use you can use. We created the cards, they'll be available soon. They accompany our book, the dog-eared copy of the book that you'll be using every day as your Gideon's Bible in the drawer of the hotel room. And hopefully this will be something that we can use as the same way that when Business Model Generation came out, it was like, it was on a lot of people's bookshelves. We're hoping this will be that you can use it with a lot of people, conversations with lots of peers. And we think these cards are a really great way to get started. So thanks so much, Emily, and super conversation, really thought-provoking. I'll go to the next, actually, Sean, do you want to do this next set of announcements, and then I'll close this off?
Yeah, just a couple of quickies. As always, we have our, they're usually spaced 2 weeks apart. Next time, I know this is a topic you love, Andrea, so we'll have a battle in terms of which guest panelists we'll bring on, but the ecosystem of innovation. So how do you build great ecosystems, not just people in your company or even the partners and people that are supposed to work with you, but this extended group of people. So it'll be interesting to do that in early September. And then we are doing kind of around the world tour with our book. You know, it is launching for everybody, so I guess it will be available kind of in online version early September and book version in late September. And so these are the 8 different geographies that we post out once a month. So I think we've put those in the weeks between the regular Futureproofing Now webcasts. And if you go to the next slide, I think it just preaches about kind of the real kind of like banging out of the ballpark kind of North American launch, which we're going to be doing on September 29th. So, and once again, the cards will be part of that launch. You may be listening to this in January of 2021, and my hope is they're going, oh, they're still talking about that pandemic and looking at it as an old thing. But I think it'll be, you know, I'll give Andrea a lot of credit in terms of just, it's not the questions we've served up today, but it's also a wealth of different resources that fit on the back of the cards that's going to be part of these cards as well. Back to you, Andrea.
So I will close this out by just saying that I always see things differently. Honestly, I saw from outside the industry, I saw from it within the future of work and within the commercial real estate, as well as all of the examples that we had outside of that. I learned a lot. I learned the application potential of these cards, and I wrote down a few ideas. Deciding for me is I actually feel really good about the decision to make these into cards, because at first you can think, well, we're dumbing them down, we're making them simple. But to me, the ability to be really useful and practical is what all of us need, especially in this fast-paced world. And I think finally, this notion of committing. I love business. I think all of us do. And we think that we do our best work in business. And so the ability for us to express that and commit with our peers and get on the same page and align, I think is really what the purpose is of Futureproofing Next. So we will hopefully end with that, and please write any questions or ideas down and send it to us. We'll be looking forward to sharing the cards with you, sharing the books with you, and we will see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.